A millionaire, blinded by obscure motives, abandons his own daughter in the unforgiving heart of the desert. He believed he had sealed her fate, but he underestimated the dark intelligence of a raven that watched everything, ready to intervene in a way he could never have foreseen. The silence that followed her father's car departure was more deafening than any scream. Sophia blinked, the reddish desert dust still dancing in the air where the vehicle had been moments before. The distant sound of the engine faded, taking with it the last hope that this was just a nightmare, a cruel joke. But it wasn't. The yellow vastness and the relentless blue sky were real. The sun, a furnace overhead, was already beginning to punish her skin. "Father?" she called out, her voice weak, almost a hoarse whisper. There was no answer, only the echo of her own despair. "Father, where are you? This isn't funny." She spun in circles, her eyes wide, searching for any sign, any indication that he would return. But there was nothing. Only rolling dunes that stretched as far as the eye could see, and a few scattered rocks like broken teeth of a sleeping giant. The hot, dry air burned her nostrils with each breath. Panic began to set in, a chilling cold that brutally contrasted with the scorching heat around her. The realization hit her with the force of a punch to the gut. He had left her, her own father. The man who should protect her had abandoned her there in the middle of nowhere to die. Memories of the last few hours were hazy. The heated argument, the harsh words, the promise of a lesson she would never forget. But this was unthinkable. Her knees gave way, and she fell onto the hot sand, her hands covering her face in a futile attempt to stem the tears that were already flowing, mixing with the dust. Her crying was silent, choked by disbelief and the pain of betrayal. How could he? What kind of father would do this to his own daughter? It was then that she saw it. Perched atop one of the highest rocks, a dark and imposing silhouette against the dazzling sky, was a raven. It was no ordinary bird. Its eyes, even from a distance, seemed fixed on her with an almost human intelligence. There was something ancient and mysterious in its posture, a gothic aura that seemed to defy the daylight. The raven made no sound, only watched, a silent sentinel of her torment. Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine, a mix of fear and a strange, almost imperceptible curiosity. It was as if the bird was an omen, or perhaps a witness. She tried to look away, but the raven's black eyes seemed to call her back, a constant and enigmatic presence. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature became unbearable. Sophia's throat was dry and her mouth pasty. The water her father had generously left was a small, almost empty bottle, a cruel mockery. Death seemed a certainty, an inevitable fate under those conditions. Despair was an overwhelming weight. Suddenly, the raven moved. It didn't fly, but hopped from the rock to a slightly lower ledge, and then to another, always in the same direction, as if tracing an invisible path. Its movements were deliberate, almost inviting. Sophia watched, mesmerized. It was madness, she knew, but something in the bird's persistence, in its unusual presence, ignited a tiny flame within her. A spark of instinct, of stubbornness. She didn't know where to go, had no idea how to survive, but staying there, waiting for the end, was a surrender that deep down she refused to accept. With a monumental effort, Sophia stood up, swaying. Her eyes, still tear-filled, sought the raven. It stood still, looking back, as if waiting for her. Taking a deep breath of the scorching air, Sophia took a hesitant step, then another. She had no plan, just the strange company of a dark bird and a refusal to accept the fate her father had charted for her. The raven watched her, and in its gaze there was a silent promise that the truth, however buried, would come to light. Sophia's first step was agony. The hot sand burned the soles of her thin sneakers, and her muscles, already tense from shock and crying, protested. The almost empty water bottle swung in her hand, a cruel reminder of scarcity. She looked at the raven. It stood there, head tilted, as if assessing her determination. Its black eyes seemed to penetrate her soul, and for an instant, Sophia felt a strange, almost mystical connection. Are you guiding me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The raven didn't respond with a sound, but with a movement. It hopped to another rock a little further ahead and then to the sandy ground, always in the same direction, at a pace that seemed made for her, slow and steady. Sophia took another step, and then another, each one requiring monumental effort. The relentless sun punished her head, and thirst was a knife in her throat. With every meter, the image of her father, with that cold, indifferent smile as he left her, returned to haunt her. Rage was a fire that paradoxically propelled her forward. She wouldn't die there. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Where are you taking me?" she asked the raven again, which waited patiently. "There's nothing here, just sand and rocks." The raven let out a low caw, almost a murmur, and flapped its wings once, as if urging her on. It then flew a short distance, landing near a rock formation that looked slightly different from the others. It was a narrow crevice, almost imperceptible at first glance, that opened at the base of a large rock. With curiosity overcoming fear, Sophia staggered towards it. The air inside the crevice was noticeably cooler, and a deep shadow offered momentary relief from the scorching heat. She slipped inside, feeling the coolness of the stone against her back. It was a tiny refuge, but it was a refuge. "Oh, my God," she murmured, closing her eyes for an instant. The raven landed on the edge of the crevice, looking at her. Its eyes didn't hold the ferocity of a predator, but the calm observation of a guardian. Sophia took out the small water bottle. Only a few sips remained. She hesitated, knowing that was all she had, but her throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper. She took a small sip, feeling the precious liquid go down with difficulty. It wasn't enough, but it was something. You knew about this?" she asked the raven, which watched her in silence. "How?" The raven tilted its head again, and Sophia swore she saw a glint of intelligence in its eyes. It was absurd, she knew. She was exhausted, dehydrated, perhaps delirious, but the bird's presence was the only thing keeping her sane, the only thing preventing her from giving in to total despair. She spent some time in the crevice, trying to regain her strength. The raven remained nearby, a vigilant sentinel. With each passing minute, the reality of her situation became clearer. But so did the strange hope the bird had ignited. Her father wanted her dead. The idea was a bitter poison in her mouth, but also a catalyst. She would survive to confront him, to make him pay. As the sun began to move westward, the raven cawed again, a stronger sound this time, and flew out of the crevice. Sophia understood the message. It was time to move on. The crevice had been a temporary relief, but not a solution. With trembling legs and a throbbing head, she dragged herself out. The raven was waiting, perched on a higher rock, pointing towards the horizon with its dark silhouette. The direction was different now, no longer a straight line, but with a slight curve, as if following an invisible path. "All right," Sophia said, her voice a little firmer, though still hoarse. "I trust you. I have nothing else." She began to walk again, her eyes fixed on the raven. With each step, the sand seemed to drain her energy, but the image of the bird, always ahead, kept her from giving up. The desert was vast and merciless, but she wasn't alone. A raven, a creature of mystery and shadow, had chosen to be her guide, and Sophia, against all logic, was willing to follow it wherever it led, hoping that truth and perhaps justice lay at the end of that winding path. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but the heat persisted. an oppressive burden that seemed to drain the very life from Sophia. Each step was a battle, the fine, hot sand invading her sneakers, her legs heavy as lead. The water bottle had been empty for hours, and Sophia's throat scratched with every breath, a rough sandpaper promising pain. "I can't take it anymore," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, a lament lost in the vast silence of the desert. She looked at the raven, which still flew ahead, occasionally landing on distant rocks waiting for her. Its dark silhouette against the fiery sky was the only constant in her collapsing world. Are you sure where we're going?" The raven cawed, a hoarse sound that seemed to carry an urgency. It didn't wait, flying a little further ahead, landing on a rocky elevation that stood out from the surrounding dunes. There was something in the way it guided her, a precision that defied logic. It wasn't an erratic flight, but a methodical progression, as if the bird had an invisible map in its mind. The rage that had once propelled her now mingled with deep exhaustion. The image of her father's cold face, the indifference in his eyes, was an open wound. How could he? What kind of monster would abandon his own daughter to die? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered, only the searing pain of betrayal. "He'll pay," Sophia promised herself, her voice choked. "If I get out of here, he'll pay." This promise was a thin thread, but it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. With a final effort, she staggered towards the rock where the raven waited. As she approached, she realized it wasn't just a rock, but a larger formation, with a dark recess at its base. The raven flew into the recess, disappearing for a moment, and then reappeared at the entrance, looking at her. Sophia, suspicious but with no other option, dragged herself to the opening. The air there was surprisingly cooler, and the shade was a balm for her eyes and sunburned skin. She slipped inside, feeling the temperature drop a few degrees. It was a small cave, more a rock shelter than a true cave, but it offered protection from the wind that was beginning to pick up and the cold that would come with the night. She sat on the sandy ground, leaning against the cold stone wall. The raven landed on a ledge above her, its black eyes fixed on her face. There was a stillness in the bird's presence that was strangely comforting. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. You saved me again." The raven made no sound, only watched her. Sophia felt a wave of emotion. She was talking to a bird, trusting her life to it. It was proof that she was going mad, or that the situation was so desperate that any thread of hope was welcome. As daylight faded and stars began to speckle the dark sky, Sophia tried to rest. The cold of the desert night was as relentless as the heat of the day, but the shelter offered some protection. She huddled, hugging her knees, trying to conserve warmth. Her stomach rumbled painfully, and thirst was a constant torture. But there was something more, a feeling that she wasn't completely alone. The raven, perched above her, was a silent sentinel. Amidst the darkness and despair, its presence was a reminder that there was a purpose, a direction. Sophia closed her eyes, exhausted but didn't sleep deeply. Vivid nightmares of her father, of his cruel smile, haunted her. She saw herself running, but the sand trapped her, and the sun burned her. Yet in her dreams, the raven was always there, a protective shadow, a guide. At dawn, the raven cawed, a sound that woke her from her restless sleep. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was already beginning to lighten, announcing another day of infernal heat. "Already?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. Her body ached, every muscle protesting. Her mouth was dry, and her head throbbed. The raven flew out of the shelter, landing on a nearby rock, and looked back, as if calling her. Sophia sighed. The thought of continuing was almost unbearable, but the thought of staying there, waiting for death, was even worse. "All right," she said, dragging herself out of the shelter. The morning air was cool, but she knew it wouldn't last. I'm going. She followed the raven, which now guided her through slightly different terrain, fewer dunes and more rock formations. With each step, Sophia felt she was moving away, not only from the place of her abandonment, but also from the person she used to be. The desert was transforming her, forcing her to find a strength she didn't know she possessed. The raven flew ahead, and Sophia, her eyes fixed on it, felt a strange certainty. It wouldn't lead her to death, it would lead her to the truth. And that truth, she knew, would be the revenge her father so feared. The journey was long and uncertain, but with each beat of the raven's wings, a new hope, fragile as desert life, blossomed in her heart. The sun, now a sphere of fire in the east, began to pour its relentless heat upon the desert. Sophia felt each ray like a sting, draining the little moisture left in her body. Her mouth was pasty, her tongue swollen, and her head throbbed with a dull, constant ache. Her muscles screamed with every step, but she continued, her eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the raven flying ahead. It guided her through a labyrinth of rocks and small elevations, a terrain more rugged than the dunes of the previous night. I can't take it anymore, she managed to murmur, her voice a hoarse whisper. With each breath, the hot air burned her lungs. The image of her father with that disdainful smile was a bitter fuel. But even rage began to wane in the face of overwhelming exhaustion. The raven, as if sensing her despair, let out a louder caw, a sound that echoed among the rocks. It didn't stop but flew in a tight circle, as if encouraging her, and then plunged behind a particularly large and irregular rock formation, which seemed to have been sculpted by millennia of winds and sand. Sophia, with the last drop of her will, dragged herself towards the rock. As she rounded it, her eyes almost didn't believe what they saw. In a small depression protected from direct sunlight, there was a pool of water. It wasn't a bubbling spring, but an accumulation of rainwater, dark and a little murky, but undeniably water. The raven was perched on the edge of the pool, watching her. A wave of relief so intense it almost made her faint washed over her. She staggered the last few meters, falling to her knees in the damp sand beside the pool. The water, though not crystal clear, was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. She plunged her trembling hands into the pool, feeling the coolness of the liquid against her sunburned skin. She brought the water to her mouth, drinking in large gulps, not caring about the dirt or the earthy taste. It was life. It was salvation. "Water," she managed to say between gulps, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the water she drank. "Oh my God." Water. She drank until her stomach felt heavy, then washed her face and arms, feeling the dirt and sweat wash away. The raven remained silent, a vigilant sentinel, its black eyes fixed on her. After a while, with her thirst quenched and some energy returning, Sophia looked at the bird. You did it again," she whispered, her voice still hoarse, but with a new strength. "You saved me." The raven tilted its head, and Sophia swore there was a subtle satisfaction in its gaze. It then did something unexpected. It flew to a small crevice in the rock above the pool, where the sand was finer and protected. With its beak it began to scratch, not looking for food, but as if unearthing something. Sophia watched, curious. The raven pulled something small and dark from the sand. It was a piece of fabric, a fragment of cloth that seemed to have been torn from some garment. It held it in its beak for a moment, turning it, and then, with surprising agility, flew to an even higher ledge, where there was a small recess. It deposited the piece of fabric there, carefully hiding it under a loose stone, and then returned to its original position near Sophia, as if nothing had happened. Sophia frowned. What was that? A piece of cloth? Why would the raven do that? She tried to stand up to investigate, but her legs were still weak. Her mind, however, began to work. The raven was no ordinary bird. It was guiding her, saving her, and now it was guarding something. "What is that?" she asked the raven, which watched her with its enigmatic calm. "What did you hide?" The raven merely cawed, a low, thoughtful sound. Sophia felt a shiver. That bird wasn't just a guide, it was an observer, perhaps even a collector, the premise of her father abandoning her, the coldness in his eyes. And now the raven guarding a piece of fabric. Could it be? Could it be something related to the abandonment? A piece of her father's clothing? Or something that fell from his car? The idea was wild, but in the desert, where logic bent and survival was the only rule, anything was possible. The rage that had been dulled by thirst and exhaustion returned with new intensity, mixed with a pang of hope. If the raven was collecting evidence, then the truth would come to light. "He'll pay," Sophia repeated, this time with a chilling conviction. "He'll pay for this." She looked at the raven, and for the first time, she felt she wasn't just trusting it to survive, but to seek justice. The bird was her ally, her silent witness. The sun continued to climb, and the heat promised to be brutal. But with water in her stomach and her mind alight with new determination, Sophia felt renewed strength. She filled her empty water bottle with water from the pool, knowing that every drop was precious. When the raven cawed again, flying to a higher rock and pointing towards the horizon, Sophia stood up, her legs still wobbly, but her mind clearer. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "Let's go." The journey continued, but now Sophia wasn't just fighting to survive. She was on a mission, guided by a mysterious raven that seemed to have a plan of its own. A plan that she hoped would lead to her father's ruin and her own redemption. The desert was still an inferno, but with each step, Sophia felt she was approaching not death, but the truth. "Let's go." The journey continued, but now Sophia wasn't just fighting to survive. The image of the raven, hiding that piece of fabric, was fixed in Sophia's mind. She tried to rationalize, to tell herself it was just a bird, acting on instinct, perhaps guarding some random object it found. But the way it watched her, the way it had guided her to the water, and now this deliberate act of hiding something, it wasn't random. There was an intelligence, an intention. "What are you doing?" she murmured, more to herself than to the raven, as she followed it. The bird flew in wide circles ahead, maintaining a distance but always visible. "Are you collecting evidence?" The word sounded strange in the desert silence, but it made sense. Her father, a ruthless businessman, always worried about evidence, about his image, about what could be used against him. The irony was bitter. With each step, the hot sand burned her feet through her thin shoes. The sun beat down mercilessly on her head, and the water bottle, though full, seemed to diminish with every sip. But thirst and exhaustion were now accompanied by a cold flame of purpose. She couldn't die. Not now. Not before her father paid. The raven led her through a series of narrow canyons, where the rock walls offered fleeting shade, a brief respite from the scorching heat. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of her own shuffling steps and the occasional caw of the raven. She imagined her father sitting in his luxurious office, toasting her supposed death, believing he had gotten rid of her forever. The image fueled her rage, transforming it into an ironclad determination. At one point, the raven landed on a high rock and remained still, observing something in the distance. Sophia, curious, forced herself to climb a small elevation to see what it was looking at. On the horizon, a mirage shimmered, but just above it, something more concrete, a distant structure, small and indistinct, but undeniably man-made. It could be a radio tower, an observation post, or perhaps a road. "What is that?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The raven didn't answer, just looked at her, and then flew in the direction of the structure, as if inviting her to follow. A wave of hope, as fragile as the dry leaves she occasionally saw, caught between the rocks, washed over her. If there was a structure, there was civilization. There was a chance, but the distance seemed insurmountable. "It's too far," she whispered, feeling despair threaten to engulf her again. "I can't do it." The raven cawed, a sharp, insistent sound. It flew back to her, landing a few feet away, and then, to her surprise, dropped something small and shiny onto the sand at her feet. It was a button, a metal button with an engraved crest. Sophia picked it up, feeling the warm metal in her fingers. It was a button from a high-quality suit, the kind her father wore. She recognized the crest. It was the symbol of her father's company, engraved on his custom buttons. Her heart pounded. The raven wasn't just collecting evidence, it was showing her. This button. It was undeniably from her father's car, or perhaps from one of his clothes he wore on the day of the abandonment. Irrefutable proof. Sophia looked at the raven, her eyes watering. You knew," she whispered. "You knew I needed this." The raven tilted its head, its black eyes deep and full of ancient wisdom. It wasn't just a guide, it was an accomplice, a guardian of truth. Sophia's rage solidified, transforming into a cold, calculating resolve. Her father didn't just abandon her, he left traces, and the raven was finding them. She put the button in her pocket, feeling the weight of the metal like a talisman. "He'll pay," she repeated, this time with unwavering conviction. "For everything!" The raven cawed again, flying back to the highest rock and pointing towards the distant structure. Sophia took a deep breath. The journey was still long, but now she had more than hope. She had a purpose and the first piece of a puzzle that would unmask her father. The desert was still an inferno, but with each step, Sophia felt she was approaching not death, but truth and justice. The metal button, warm in her palm, was more than a simple object. It was a tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her, and to the man who had stolen it. Sophia squeezed it tightly, feeling the sharp edges of the engraved crest. That symbol, which for years had represented her father's power and influence, now transformed into an emblem of his betrayal. "He didn't care," she whispered, her voice choked with rage and a pain that seemed to tear at her chest. "He didn't care about leaving me here to die, but he was careless enough to leave this." She looked at the raven, which watched her with an almost human intensity. You knew, didn't you? You knew I needed this." The raven cawed softly, a sound that, to Sophia, seemed like confirmation. It wasn't just a bird, it was a herald, a collector of forgotten truths. The idea that such a small and seemingly insignificant creature could be the key to unmasking such a powerful man was both absurd and deeply satisfying. Putting the button in her pocket, Sophia felt its weight. It wasn't heavy in itself, but the burden of its meaning was immense. It was the first piece of a puzzle she was determined to assemble, no matter the cost. The mirage of the distant structure, once a symbol of fragile hope, now became a beacon, a non-negotiable destination. "Let's go," she said to the raven, her voice now devoid of hesitation, tinged with a cold and unwavering resolve. "Let's go there." The raven flew ahead, its movements fluid and effortless, contrasting with Sophia's struggle with every step. The sun scalded the desert with relentless fury, and the sand seemed to swallow her energy. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry, despite the water she had drunk. But the image of the button in her pocket, her father's crest, was an antidote to despair. She imagined the reunion. There would be no tears of supplication, no pleas for forgiveness. Only the cold presentation of the truth, the exposure of his cruelty. That button would be the proof, the tip of the iceberg of his villainy. The raven guided her through increasingly rugged terrain, up and down sand dunes that seemed to stretch endlessly. The rocks, once flat, now formed small elevations and canyons, offering a labyrinth of shadows and heat. In one of these canyons, the raven landed on a rocky ledge, waiting for her. Sophia, exhausted, dragged herself to it, her body protesting with every movement. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The raven tilted its head, its eyes fixed on a spot in the sand, near a large, smooth stone. Sophia looked where it indicated. Almost imperceptible, half buried in the sand, was a small object. She knelt, feeling the hot sand on her knees. It was a card, a business card, crumpled and faded by the sun, but still recognizable. With trembling fingers, Sophia picked it up. Her father's name was printed in elegant letters, Arthur Vance. Below, his company's name and a phone number. It was one of the cards he always carried, a symbol of his identity, now tossed to the wind as if it were trash. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. He really didn't care about leaving traces, she murmured, feeling a wave of nausea. It wasn't just the abandonment, it was the negligence, the certainty that no one would ever find her, that no evidence would remain. But the raven was there. She put the card with the button, feeling the growing volume of her small collection of evidence. Each item was a nail in the coffin of her father's reputation. The raven cawed again, a sound that seemed to echo her own determination. The structure on the horizon was still there, a distant point, but now it seemed less unattainable. With each piece of evidence the raven brought her, Sophia felt an injection of strength, a purpose that transcended mere survival. She wasn't just walking, she was marching. "Thank you," she said to the raven, her voice full of deep and unexpected gratitude. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." The raven looked at her, and Sophia swore there was an understanding in its black eyes. It then took flight again, guiding her out of the canyon, towards the setting sun that was beginning to tint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Night would bring a temporary relief from the heat, but also new dangers. However, Sophia felt no fear. She had a guardian, a purpose, and the truth in her pocket. The journey continued, and with each step, her father's shadow diminished, while her own lengthened, strong and relentless. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vast expanse of the desert in hues of fire and grey. The breeze that had once been a warm breath now brought a chilling air that penetrated Sophia's thin clothes. The change was abrupt, and with it, a new layer of challenge emerged. The distant structure, once a point of hope, now dissolved into the growing darkness, becoming an uncertain promise. "Where do we go now?" Sophia asked the raven, her voice trembling slightly with the cold. The bird, which had landed on a nearby rock, looked like an even more gothic silhouette against the starry sky that was beginning to emerge. It cawed, a low, guttural sound, and then took flight, not towards the structure, but towards a dark crevice in the rocks, a little ahead. Sophia followed it, her feet aching and every muscle in her body protesting. The crevice revealed itself to be a small cave, more a recess in the rock than a deep cavern, but it offered welcome shelter from the cutting wind. The raven landed on a high ledge, watching her. "You brought me to a shelter," she murmured, surprise mixed with an almost childlike gratitude. She huddled on the sandy ground, trying to warm herself. The cold was intense, and she knew that a desert night could be as dangerous as the day. The raven descended from its ledge and, to Sophia's surprise, began to push with its beak and feet some dry branches and leaves that were hidden in a corner of the cave. It dragged them close to her, as if preparing a small bonfire. Sophia watched, fascinated. You want me to make a fire?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The idea seemed absurd. She had no matches, no lighter. But the raven looked at her with an intensity that suggested it expected her to understand. She rummaged through her pockets, more out of habit than hope. Her father's button, the business card, they were the only things she had. But then her fingers touched something else, a small metal lighter which she had completely forgotten about. It was an old gift from a friend, which she kept in her purse and which, by some miracle, had remained in her pocket when she was abandoned. A faint laugh escaped her lips. "You're unbelievable," she said to the raven, holding the lighter. "How did you know?" The raven merely watched her, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. With trembling hands, Sophia managed to light the dry branches. A small flame crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The warmth was an immediate and profound relief. She extended her hands to the fire, feeling life slowly return to her frozen fingers. As the fire warmed her body, the evidence in her pocket warmed her soul with a cold determination. She took out the button and the business card, observing them in the flickering light. Each was a fragment of the life her father had tried to extinguish, and now they were the weapons of her retribution. "He thought I would disappear without a trace," she whispered, more to herself than to the raven. "That I would just be another statistic, a rebellious daughter who got lost. But he underestimated the desert, and he underestimated you." The raven, perched near the cave entrance, seemed to stand guard. Its black eyes swept the darkness outside, as if protecting not only Sophia, but also the truths she carried. The night advanced, and with it, the desert silence became almost oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of some distant nocturnal creature. Sophia drank a little water, rationing it carefully. She knew the fire wouldn't last all night and the cold would return, but for now there was warmth, shelter, and an unwavering purpose. She thought of the distant structure. What would it be? A research station? A military outpost? It didn't matter. It was a point of contact with the world, and she needed to get there. She needed to tell her story. She needed to show the evidence. Sleep seemed an impossibility, but exhaustion was immense. She leaned back against the rocky wall, her eyes fixed on the flames. The raven, in its silent vigil, was the sole witness to her pain and her growing strength. She was no longer the frightened girl abandoned in the desert. She was Sophia Vance, and she was coming back, and her father, Arthur Vance, would have no escape from the truth she would bring with her. The night, which had once seemed a veil of despair, was now a cloak of waiting, a prelude to the storm she was about to unleash. The desert night was a paradox of silence and life. The crackling of the fire was the only melody that broke the oppressive stillness, while the wind whispered ancient stories through the rocks. Sophia, huddled near the flames, felt the warmth penetrate her bones, but the cold in her soul persisted. She watched the raven, a dark and imposing silhouette against the cave entrance, its eyes like two black pearls that seemed to absorb all light. "He thought I was weak," she whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. "He thought I would bend, that I would break, that the desert would swallow me and no one would ever know." She squeezed the button and the business card in her hand, feeling the cold texture of the metal and the roughness of the paper. "But he didn't count on you, did he?" The raven didn't respond with a caw, but with a subtle tilt of its head, as if it understood every unspoken word. Sophia felt a deep and inexplicable connection with the creature. It wasn't just an animal, it was a confidant, an accomplice in her quest for justice. The idea that her father, such a calculating and powerful man, could be brought down by a handful of insignificant objects, and the silent testimony of a raven, was almost poetic in its irony. She replayed the events in her mind, every detail of the abandonment, the coldness in Arthur Vance's gaze. The pain was a constant reminder, but now it came with a controlled fury, a fire that burned stronger than the bonfire before her. Her tears had dried, replaced by an ironclad determination. She wouldn't cry anymore, not for him. Sleep didn't come easily. Each time her eyes closed, the image of her father's face appeared, distorted by betrayal. But each time, she clung to the reality of the button and the card in her pocket, the anchors that bound her to her mission. The raven remained on its vigil, a tireless guardian, and its presence was a silent comfort, a promise that she wasn't alone. As the first rays of sun began to tint the horizon, a pale pink, Sophia felt a new surge of energy. The night's cold still lingered, but the promise of the day brought with it the strength to continue. She extinguished the fire with sand, conserving the lighter. "Let's go," she said to the raven, rising with difficulty. Her muscles ached, her throat was dry, but the distant structure, now a little clearer against the brightening sky, was an irresistible magnet. The raven flew ahead, leading her out of the cave. The desert, under the morning light, revealed new nuances. The dunes seemed less threatening, the rocks more defined. They followed a dry riverbed where the sand was more compact, making walking a little easier. Suddenly, the raven landed on a low rock, cawing with a different urgency. Sophia approached, her heart beating faster. It pointed with its beak to something semi-buried in the sand near the base of the rock. It was a small, cylindrical, metallic object that reflected the rising sun's light. Sophia knelt. Curiosity and apprehension mingled. With careful fingers, she unearthed it. It was a pen. Not an ordinary pen, but an elegant, heavy, dark metal fountain pen. On the cap, engraved in fine letters, were the initials A.V. Arthur Vance. A humorless laugh escaped her cracked lips. "He really didn't bother to be discreet," she murmured, feeling a wave of shock and satisfaction. That pen was unmistakable. Her father used it to sign important documents, a symbol of his authority and wealth. How had it gotten there? Had it fallen from his pocket when he abandoned her, or had he thrown it away, in his haste, to get rid of any trace? The pen joined the button and the card in her pocket, each item a link in the chain she was forging. They weren't just objects, they were fragments of truth, silent witnesses to a heinous crime. Each discovery was an adrenaline shot, a reminder that she was on the right path. "One more," she said to the raven, holding the pen for a moment before putting it away. "One more proof of his cruelty." The raven cawed, a sound that seemed like approval, and took flight again. The distant structure now seemed to have grown, its lines more defined against the pale blue sky. It was no longer a mirage, but a tangible reality, a point of arrival. Sophia felt renewed strength, an energy that transcended her physical exhaustion. She wasn't just walking, she was advancing, driven by an unwavering purpose. With each step, the image of her father, once so imposing, diminished in her mind, replaced by the figure of the raven, her silent guide, and by the certainty that the truth, no matter how much they tried to bury it, would always find a way to come to light. The journey was far from over, but Sophia knew that, with every piece of evidence in her pocket and the raven by her side, she was one step closer to unmasking Arthur Vance. The light of the rising sun, which had once promised a new beginning, soon transformed into relentless heat. The desert awoke with a silent ferocity, and each of Sophia's steps kicked up clouds of fine dust that clung to her skin and throat. Arthur Vance's pen, the button, and the business card weighed in her pocket, not by their metal or paper, but by the burden of their truth. "He didn't think I'd survive even one night," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, her lips cracked. The raven, flying in wide circles above her, seemed to agree, its occasional caws a dark punctuation to her thoughts. The distant structure, now more defined, seemed like a beacon, but with each kilometer covered, exhaustion intensified. Her feet, already raw, protested with every step on the scorching sand. The water in her bottle dwindled dangerously, and thirst was a constant torture. But the fire in her chest, fueled by rage and determination, was stronger than any physical pain. She couldn't stop, not now. The raven descended, landing in front of her on a higher rock, and turned its head, observing her with its piercing eyes. It was as if it was assessing her, measuring her resilience. Sophia felt a shiver. "You know I won't give up, don't you?" she said, challenging herself and the vastness of the desert. It cawed, a hoarse sound that seemed to echo her own conviction, and then took flight again, leading her along a path that seemed less steep, circumventing a treacherous dune. Sophia followed it, blindly trusting her winged guide. It had led her to shelter, to fire, and to another piece of evidence. It wouldn't abandon her now. The structure revealed itself as a complex of low, light-colored buildings that blended almost perfectly with the landscape. It looked like a research station, or perhaps a guard post. There was a satellite dish on top of one of the buildings, an unmistakable sign of communication with the outside world. Hope, once a thin thread, now became a strong rope in her heart. As they approached, the raven landed on a dry bush, and Sophia noticed it was observing something on the ground. She dragged herself to it, curiosity overcoming the pain in her legs. Among some stones, semi-buried in the sand, was a small glass bottle. It was a masculine perfume bottle of an exclusive brand her father used. The scent, though faint, was unmistakable. Sophia picked up the bottle, her fingers trembling. "It can't be," she whispered. Her voice choked. Arthur Vance was meticulous, obsessive about his image. He would never discard a perfume bottle so carelessly, unless he was in a hurry, unless he was so certain no one would ever find it. She examined the bottle. There were no initials, but the shape and aroma were enough proof for her. It was another link, another piece of the puzzle she was assembling. Her father didn't just abandon her, he left a trail of his presence, a trail that the raven, her silent guardian, was helping her unearth. "He was here," she said, her voice full of a new and cold conviction. "He was here, in this exact spot. He left me here." The image of her father, once distant and abstract in his cruelty, now materialized in the desert, a ghost of his betrayal. The raven cawed again, a sound that seemed like confirmation, and then flew towards the structure. Sophia put the bottle with the other evidence. Each item was a weight in her pocket, but also a strength in her soul. She wasn't just carrying objects, she was carrying the truth. The distance to the station was now only a few hundred meters. She could see the windows, the doors. There were signs of life. She could do this. She had to do this. The pain in her muscles was excruciating, but adrenaline pulsed through her veins. "We're almost there," she said to the raven, which now waited for her on the roof of one of the buildings. Almost there. The journey through the desert, which should have been her end, had become her rebirth. She had been forged in the relentless heat and the cutting cold, guided by a creature that defied all logic. And now she was ready to face her father, not as the vulnerable daughter he abandoned, but as the woman the desert and the raven had helped her become. The storm was about to begin. She couldn't stop. Not now. Sophia felt a shiver. She examined the bottle. There were signs of life. She could do this. Almost there. With the last remnant of strength, Sophia staggered the final meters, the sand giving way beneath her feet. The research station, once a mirage, now stood before her, real and imposing. The windows, though dusty, reflected the midday sun. She could distinguish a heavy metal door, and beside it, a control panel. There was no visible movement, no sound beyond the wind. Hope mingled with a primal fear. The raven from the rooftop watched her with its usual intensity. Sophia approached the door, her trembling hand rising to touch the cold metal. It was the end of one part of her journey and the beginning of another, even more uncertain. She looked at the raven, which seemed to nod in silence. It was time. It was time. Sophia knocked on the metal door, first with her palm, then with her fist, each knock a hollow echo that seemed to drain the rest of her energy. "Hello!" Her voice was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. "Is anyone there? Please." She waited, her heart pounding erratically, the sound muffled in her ears. Nothing. Despair threatened to engulf her. a cold wave after the infernal desert heat. Would this be the ultimate irony? To survive hell only to find an abandoned outpost? Just as she was about to give in, her vision blurred. A light flashed on the control panel. A low hum preceded the sound of a latch unlocking. The door creaked, opening just a crack. A cautious eye appeared in the opening, followed by a bearded, wrinkled face, framed by disheveled grey hair. It was a middle-aged man, wearing a sand-stained work uniform, with reading glasses hanging around his neck. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" His voice was harsh, laden with suspicion, as if he were accustomed to dealing with unwelcome intruders. Sophia tried to speak, but her throat was dry and scratchy. "Water," she managed to stammer, her lips cracked and sore. "Please, I was abandoned." The man examined her from head to toe, his eyes scanning her torn clothes, her sunburned skin, the wild and desperate look in her eyes. He hesitated, visibly disturbed by the apparition. Abandoned? In the middle of the desert? That's impossible. No one gets here on foot. "My father," Sophia began, her voice gaining a thread of strength, fueled by the rage that kept her standing. "Arthur Vance. He left me here to die." The name seemed to have an effect. The man frowned, a shadow of recognition, or perhaps disbelief, passing through his eyes. "Arthur Vance? The magnate? You're delirious, young lady. He's one of the most powerful men in the country." "I'm not!" Sophia insisted, taking a step forward, almost falling, but leaning against the door. "I have evidence. He left me here. Please help me. I need water and a phone." The man, who introduced himself as Dr. Elias Thorne, a geologist in charge of the station, opened the door a little wider, still reluctant, but the urgency in Sophia's voice was undeniable. He saw the determination in her eyes, something that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Come in. But if this is some kind of prank or bad joke, I swear." Sophia staggered inside, the indoor air conditioning a welcome shock against her scorching skin. The raven, from the rooftop, let out a sharp caw, almost a warning before taking flight, disappearing into the blue sky, but its presence still lingered in Sophia's mind. Inside the small control room, Elias helped her sit on a cold metal chair. He brought her a glass of water, which Sophia drank eagerly, feeling life slowly return to her veins, each sip a balm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse, but with a tone of genuine gratitude. "Tell me," Elias said, his expression still serious, but with a touch of curiosity. "How does a daughter of Arthur Vance end up alone in the desert? And why would he do something like this?" Sophia took a deep breath, gathering her last strength, the story forming in her mind. She took the objects from her pocket, placing them carefully on the metal table. The gold pen, the cufflink, the business card, and finally, the perfume bottle. "He brought me here under the pretext of a business trip. He drugged me and threw me out of the car. I woke up alone, in the middle of nowhere, certain I would die." She pointed to the objects, each an irrefutable piece of her truth. "This pen is his, this cufflink too, the business card, and this perfume. He never got rid of anything like this. He was in a hurry. He was certain I wouldn't be found." Elias picked up the objects, examining them with growing seriousness. The perfume in particular seemed to convince him. He smelled it, and his eyes widened slightly. "I know that brand. It's exclusive, yes. And Vance is known for his eccentricity, to say the least." He looked at Sophia, his distrust replaced by a mixture of shock and horror. "If what you say is true, this is a heinous crime, young lady, a scandal that will shake the country." "It's the truth," Sophia affirmed, her voice firm, rage solidifying into determination. "I need to contact the police and a lawyer. I want him to pay for this. I want everyone to know what he did." Elias nodded, the gravity of the situation weighing on him. We have a long-range radio and a satellite phone. I can try to make a connection. But this is going to be a bombshell. The media will go crazy." He looked at the satellite dish on the roof, then at Sophia, his eyes seeking confirmation of her resolve. "Are you ready for this, for the circus that's coming?" Sophia looked at her hands, at the scars and dirt, at the strength the desert and the raven had given her. She had survived. She had collected the evidence. She had been guided by a mysterious creature. She was no longer the fragile girl her father had abandoned. "I'm ready," she said, her voice full of a cold and unwavering resolve. "He's going to regret the day he thought he could get rid of me." The storm, which had once been merely a metaphor, was now about to explode into Arthur Vance's world, and Sophia, the desert survivor, would be its epicenter. The gravity of Sophia's words hung in the rarefied air of the research station. Elias Thorne, the geologist, held the perfume bottle, his thumb brushing its smooth surface as his eyes, once skeptical, now fixed on Sophia with a mixture of astonishment and growing understanding. He knew Arthur Vance's reputation, the ruthless magnate, but the idea of such depravity was almost unimaginable. "Arthur Vance," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "He's untouchable, a pillar of society. If what you say is true, this is more than a crime. It's an affront to everything we thought we knew about him." Sophia, sitting in the metal chair, felt extreme exhaustion begin to take its toll, but her mind remained sharp, driven by a force that came from deep within her soul. "He's a monster, Dr. Thorne. A monster who thought he could get rid of me as if I were a nuisance, but he underestimated me. And the desert." She paused, a glint of defiance in her eyes. "And he underestimated the raven." Elias looked at her, then at the objects on the table. The gold pen, the cufflink with the discreet initials, the impeccable business card, the exclusive perfume. Each one a piece of a macabre puzzle. "The raven?" he asked, an eyebrow raised. "My guardian," Sophia replied, a faint, enigmatic smile playing on her cracked lips. "He guided me, showed me where to look. He helped me survive." Elias shook his head slowly, absorbing the surreal story. "Well, raven or not, this evidence is convincing, especially the perfume. It's a very particular fragrance. And the pen. The engraving is clear." He stood up, his initial hesitation replaced by a grim determination. "We need to make that call, now." He moved to a complex panel of radio and satellite equipment. His experienced fingers began adjusting knobs and tuning frequencies. The hum of electronics filled the small room, mixing with the sound of the wind outside. Sophia watched, every fiber of her being tense with anticipation. That moment, she knew, would change everything. "The satellite connection is the most reliable from here," Elias explained, his eyes fixed on the indicators. "It might take a minute to stabilize. Who would you like to contact, local police or directly the capital?" "The Capitol Police," Sophia replied without hesitation. "They'll have more resources to deal with someone like Arthur Vance, and I need a lawyer, a good one." The radio crackled, then a clearer signal established itself. Elias picked up the microphone, his voice grave and formal. "Delta 7 Research Station calling. Repeat, Delta 7 Station, requesting emergency contact with the Capital Metropolitan Police. We have an extremely urgent situation." There was a moment of silence, followed by a somewhat sleepy female voice coming from the radio. "Delta 7, this is Central. What is the nature of the emergency? You're too far for a standard patrol. We have a victim of attempted murder, abandonment in the desert, involving a high-profile public figure," Elias declared, his voice firm. "The victim is here, with irrefutable evidence. She is Sophia Vance, daughter of Arthur Vance." A longer silence followed, laden with disbelief. Then the voice from Central returned, now more alert, with a tone of shock. "Sophia Vance, the magnate's daughter. This is... Dr. Thorne, are you sure about what you're saying?" "Absolutely," Elias replied, looking at Sophia, who nodded with an unwavering expression. "She is exhausted, but lucid. And the evidence is tangible. We need a rescue and investigation team as quickly as possible, and a lawyer for Ms. Vance." The voice from Central, now fully awake, began to give instructions, the urgency and gravity of the situation finally sinking in. "Understood, Dr. Thorne. We are dispatching the rescue team and a specialized investigation unit. The police chief will be notified immediately. Keep Ms. Vance safe and do not touch the evidence. A team will be en route. It may take a few hours given your location." Elias confirmed and turned off the radio, silence returning to the room. But now it was a different silence, laden with immense weight. He turned to Sophia, his eyes expressing a mixture of admiration and concern. "They're coming," he said. "The machine has started to turn. There's no stopping it now." Sophia nodded, a deep sigh escaping her lips. Exhaustion suddenly hit her, but the satisfaction of having taken the first step was stronger. "I know," she replied, her voice a little stronger now, "and I'm ready. He thought he'd bury me in the desert, but I came back to unearth him." Outside, the midday sun continued to punish the landscape, but the storm Sophia had promised was now on its way, not of sand and wind, but of justice and revelation, ready to sweep away Arthur Vance's empire. The silence that followed the radio call was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with the imminent promise of justice, the echo of Sophia's voice, and the gravity of the revelations. Elias Thorne, still standing by the radio panel, watched Sophia. Her exhaustion was palpable, but the resolve in her eyes was a flame the desert hadn't managed to extinguish. "They estimate a few hours," Elias said, his voice softer now, devoid of its previous formality. "The station's location is remote, but they will come, and they will come with full force." Sophia nodded, an almost imperceptible tremor running through her body. Relief was a wave that threatened to overwhelm her. I need a shower, Dr. Thorne, and perhaps something to eat, if you have any." Of course, he replied, genuine concern replacing his initial shock. "We have a small living quarter here. It's simple, but it has hot water and some provisions. Come." He guided her out of the control room, through a narrow corridor, to a Spartan room with a single bed and a small bathroom. The air conditioning here was even more powerful, a balm for Sophia's sunburned skin. "Water is limited, but enough for a quick shower," Elias explained, pointing to the shower. "I'll prepare something for you to eat. Make yourself at home. Don't worry about anything." Sophia entered the bathroom, feeling the warm water run down her body, washing away the dirt, the sweat, and in a way, part of the trauma. She scrubbed her skin, watching the dark water go down the drain, taking the desert with it, but not the memories. The scars on her hands and arms were a physical reminder of her ordeal, but also of her resilience. She was no longer the spoiled girl Arthur Vance had abandoned. She was Sophia, the survivor. As she dried herself with a rough towel, her mind flew to the raven. Where would it be now? Watching from some high point, perhaps. She felt a pang of gratitude and a strange connection with the creature. It had been her guide, her silent guardian, the only constant presence in her hellish journey. As she left the bathroom, dressed in a t-shirt and sweatpants Elias had left for her, men's clothes but clean and comfortable, she found a food tray on the small room's table, a simple sandwich, some fruit, and a glass of juice. Hunger hit her with renewed force. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, energy gradually returning. Elias knocked on the door and entered, holding a mug of hot tea. "How do you feel?" "Better," Sophia replied, her voice clearer. "Thank you for everything, Dr. Thorne. I don't know what I would have done without you." "I just did What any decent human being would do, he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. But I admit the story is shocking. Arthur Vance. It's hard to believe. He's a master of appearances, Sophia murmured, looking at the tea mug. Always has been. But behind the facade of a philanthropist and successful businessman, there's a cruel and calculating man. And the raven? Elias asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Do you really believe it guided you? Sophia smiled, a small, melancholic smile. I don't know how to explain it, Dr. Thorne, but it was there, always, showing me the way, alerting me. It led me to the objects my father left, to the places where I would find water. It was my dark-feathered guardian angel. Elias shook his head, a mix of skepticism and admiration on his face. The desert has strange ways of testing and transforming us. Perhaps the human mind, under extreme stress, finds meaning in everything around it. He paused. But the evidence is real, and that's what matters now. The hours dragged on. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple, an ironic beauty for the unfolding drama. Sophia and Elias waited in the control room, the pieces of evidence carefully untouched on the table. The radio was on, but silent, anticipation weighing in the air. Suddenly, a distant point on the horizon became a cloud of dust. The sound of engines approached, breaking the desert silence. Elias stood up, his eyes fixed on the window. They're here! Two rugged vehicles with flashing lights pulled up in front of the station. Several uniformed figures dismounted, their movements swift and professional. A man and a woman, both with detective badges, approached the door, followed by paramedics. The detective, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes, was the first to enter. She swept the room with her gaze, stopping at Sophia, then at the objects on the table. "Dr. Elias Thorne?" she asked, her voice firm. "I'm Detective Ramirez. This is Detective Silva. We understand you have an emergency situation here." "Yes, Detective," Elias replied, pointing to Sophia. "This is Sophia Vance. She was abandoned in the desert by her father, Arthur Vance, and this is the evidence." Detective Ramirez's eyes widened slightly upon seeing Sophia, thin and scarred, but with a posture of unwavering dignity. She then turned to the table, her eyes fixed on the objects. She picked up the perfume bottle, smelled it, and an expression of shock deepened on her face. "Sophia Vance," she murmured, almost to herself. "This is unbelievable." "It's the truth, Detective," Sophia said, her voice hoarse, but charged with a strength that surprised even herself. "My father tried to kill me, but I survived, and I have the evidence. I want him to pay for this." Detective Ramirez looked at Sophia, then at the objects, and finally at Elias. Initial disbelief gave way to grim seriousness. "Ms. Vance, what you are alleging is extremely serious. We need a detailed statement, and we will need you to be examined by the paramedics." The paramedics approached, but Sophia stopped them with a gesture. "I will do whatever it takes, but first I want you to know Arthur Vance is not who he appears to be, and I will not rest until the truth is revealed." Outside, the last ray of sun disappeared, plunging the desert into a starry darkness. But inside the small research station, a new light began to shine, the light of justice, ready to expose the deepest shadows of the Vance empire. The storm had arrived. The sand swirled softly around the tires of the arriving vehicles, a final, almost poetic dance of the desert before the cold, hard reality of the law took over. Detective Ramirez, a woman whose face bore the marks of years navigating the city's darkest currents, studied Sophia with an intensity that seemed to want to unravel every secret. Detective Silva, younger and with a still visible expression of shock, observed the objects on the table with a mixture of fascination and repulsion. "Ms. Vance," Ramirez began, her voice serious, but with a tone that suggested an attempt at empathy. We understand you've been through an indescribable trauma. The paramedics are here to take care of you. Afterwards, we need your version of events, with as much detail as possible. Sophia, despite her exhaustion, felt a surge of strength. It was time. I'm fine, Detective. I survived. And yes, I want to tell you everything. But first, I want you to see this. She gestured to the objects. My father, Arthur Vance, took me to the desert with the intention of killing me. He left me there without water, without food, without a chance. He thought I would die, that my body would never be found, and that he would get rid of me and any obstacle to his plans. Ramirez picked up the perfume bottle, the same one Arthur had dropped. This bottle, what does it mean? It's the perfume my mother used, Sophia explained, her voice choked with memory. A gift my father gave her years ago. He dropped it near where he abandoned me, like a cruel signature. I found it, and it became a constant reminder of his betrayal. Detective Silva, wearing gloves, examined the small digital camera. And this camera? My father is obsessed with technology. He had this camera to record moments. I found it. It contains images he took, and also some I recorded myself, documenting my journey and the evidence I found. Sophia took a deep breath. He left a map, Detective, a map with marked points. He thought I would die before understanding, but I understood. Each point was a location where he had left something of mine, something that linked me to him, so that if my body were found, there would be a convenient explanation. Elias intervened, his voice calm. The objects were handled just enough to be identified and kept safe, Detective. We did not touch surfaces that might have fingerprints. The camera and the bottle were placed in clean plastic bags as soon as Ms. Vance brought them. Ramirez nodded, her eyes fixed on Sophia. Ms. Vance, this is an extremely serious accusation. Arthur Vance is an incredibly powerful and influential man. He has the best lawyers, the best contacts. I know, Sophia replied, a determined glint in her eyes. He has all the power in the world, but I have the truth, and I have the evidence. He underestimated my will to live, and he underestimated the intelligence of a raven. The detectives exchanged a look. The raven? Elias cleared his throat. Ms. Vance refers to a presence that guided her. It's an unusual part of the story, but the material evidence is undeniable. Ramirez raised an eyebrow but didn't question further. There were more urgent matters. All right, let's start with the formal statement. Detective Silva, please prepare the recording equipment. Paramedics, please examine Ms. Vance. Dr. Thorne, could you guide us to where the objects were found, if possible, for a site analysis? Sophia felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. The machine of justice, slow and relentless, had finally been set in motion. She looked at the desert through the window, where the night's darkness had swallowed the last colors of the sunset. Somewhere out there, she knew, the raven watched. Its work was done. Hers, however, was just beginning. I will testify, Sophia said, her voice now firm and clear. I will tell every detail, and I won't stop until Arthur Vance is exposed for who he truly is. He tried to erase me from existence, but I came back, and now he will pay. The paramedics approached, and Sophia allowed them to examine her, her mind already preparing for the battle ahead. The sandstorm had transformed into a legal storm, and Sophia Vance, the desert survivor, was ready to be its epicenter. Arthur Vance's empire was about to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of the truth that a raven and a determined daughter had brought to light.